Hello, and welcome to another Florida Native Plant Society Lunch and Learn. I'm Valerie Anderson, your host for these Lunch and Learns. So before we get started, I have Patti here. She is on my other screen in a Zoom meeting. I'm very happy to have her. We've been chatting. And we have a pre-recorded video because Patti is off today and she wanted to make sure that the recording looked good and was very professional, but she is here for the Q&A. So we have it, I edited it, so it's a little bit shorter than usual because I clipped out ums and, a little bit of chatter. So again, before we get started, we still have our annual fund drive going on. We have a $50,000 goal and we are just above 30. So if you could help us out, I have made a little graphic here, and so please donate now, fnps.org/donate. All of us, I pitched in to hit the match, the first $10,000 matched, and so we've exceeded that. So if you could please help us out on our annual fund drive, we would be very grateful. Secondly, are you a member of the Florida Native Plant Society? I am, Patti is, most everyone you see on these programs are, but we rely on membership as most of our budget, and it's really important for us to be able to continue working to preserve, conserve, and restore the native plants and native plant communities of Florida, and to run these educational programs. So if you're not a member, you can join today at fnps.org/join. And so without further ado, let's go to Patti. Hey Patti.
Hi Valerie, how are you today?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm very good. I'm excited to have a chance to talk with the Native Plant Society. It's always a wonderful opportunity for me.
We're so happy to have you. It's been a few months.
Yeah, we've all been busy.
So I see you have a cool shirt that we can't really see. What's going on with that? It's very patterned.
This is a shirt from Indonesia. It's was a gift and one of my favorites. It's pretty elaborate design. So I thought I would change from the Hawaiian shirt to give another country a chance. Some people wonder why the Department of Agriculture, especially the Division of Plant Industry, would work on native plants or be concerned with native plants. But as you might not know, part of our mission is to protect native plants as well as commercially produced plants. So I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so for anybody who's here, you can put your questions in the chat there on YouTube, or if you're not signed in or your question's too long, feel free to text me or email me, communications@fnps.org. All right, Patti, go ahead.
Well, hello again. As you heard, I'm Patti Anderson, a botanist with the Division of Plant Industry, which is part of the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. I know you've all heard about planting the right plant in the right place. Well, today we're going to talk about some plants that were the wrong plant in the wrong place, noxious weeds and invasive species. So as I mentioned in the introduction, a part of our mission is to protect Florida's native and commercially grown plants, as well as the bee industry, from pests and diseases. Well, one of the pests we find are unfortunately pest plants. You've probably all encountered some of these pests as you've been in natural areas around the state. Just as a reminder, you probably know this, but plants from other places can threaten our native plants just by being here. They take up space that could have been used by native plants. They crowd them out. Some of them even have chemicals that inhibit the growth of other species. So they want to be the biggest and biggest on the block and take over as much space as they can. They can also sometimes disrupt some of the processes that our native plants depend on, like the frequency of fire. They take up water that's no longer available to native plants, and they can change the soil nutrient cycles and make important chemicals less available to our Florida plants. So some people wonder, how do the plants get to Florida? You know, it's a peninsula with a lot of tourism, There are airports all over. People bring in things, and even though we say, please don't pack a pest, people like to bring plants. There are also the hurricanes that come to Florida. If you see this map of hurricane tracks, every part of Florida gets hit with strong winds that could potentially carry seeds or other propagative material for non-native plants. Sometimes we think about birds flying. As they migrate, they might have seeds stuck to their legs, or they might deposit seeds in a little packet of fertilizer. But really, the most devastating thing that we do is introduce plants ourselves as ornamental. There are estimates that range up to 85% of the invasive species that we experience in Florida were introduced as ornamental plants. And even though we have border guards who look for pests, it's sometimes hard for them to know what plant is going to become a pest. So as we go through this presentation, we'll talk about some of the rules and some of the ways we might think about trying to prevent noxious weeds in the future. So according to the Florida Plant Atlas, which is a website I hope all of you are familiar with, Florida has over 3,000 native species and over 1,500 non-native species that have been collected in the wild. But many of the plants that we bring in are well behaved. We don't have over 1,500 invasive species and noxious weeds. Some of them just spread a little from the yard where they were planted, but don't really make an impact on natural areas. So we often enjoy some of these ornamental plants from other places and appreciate them in our yards and gardens. But on the other hand, there are plants that come as ornamentals or have other uses, feed for livestock, plants to control erosion. And then they take over. If you've seen kudzu growing, you know what I'm talking about. So how is it we let these plants take over? I mean, can't you just pull them up when they're young? Well, for many plants, they grow quietly in the background for many years. If you're from South Florida, you know Melaleuca and Casuarina, Australian pine. They were brought to this country around 1900. Well, 1976, Julia Morton, a famous botanist of South Florida, wrote an article that mentions these plants and Brazilian pepper. And her conclusion is these are now receiving serious attention as problems. So now, 75 years later, people started to notice there were large tracts of these plants where they had not been planted. Another example we could look at a little bit is Brazilian pepper, Schinus terebinthifolia. It was introduced in the 1840s. It covers vast stretches of South and Central Florida. In fact, we thought it was confined to South and Central Florida, but over time, plants change, and some of them become a little more cold tolerant. And as you can see from this distribution map, again from the Florida Plant Atlas, the counties in green are places where this Brazilian pepper has been found. So it's going all the way up to North Florida, at least along the coast. And surprise, you can buy it on the internet. Now, internet sales are incredibly difficult to regulate. I said our job at DPI is to protect native and commercially grown plants. But the internet is so slippery. People can pop up with sites, disappear, and unless we're notified, we don't have a very good way of monitoring those sites for sales of noxious weeds or invasive species. So if you see it on the web, let us know. We'll do our best to pursue the seller. Sometimes they understand that plants can't be sold in Florida. So when you get to the checkout counter with your cart full of noxious weeds, if your address is Florida, they'll say we cannot ship. Or they'll have a notice on the site that says these plants cannot be sent to Florida. But more often, they just don't know. And so they will ship them anywhere. So please don't buy noxious weeds on the internet, even though they can be found. And let us know at DPI if you see them. So to talk a little bit more about what is being done to control noxious weeds, prevent their spread, we'll talk about a couple of things, both government regulations and non-governmental organizations that are trying to provide public information. So at the federal level, the United States Department of Agriculture works with noxious weeds. And at the state level, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is responsible. We'll mention the University of Florida. IFAS has groups that work on noxious weeds, and another voluntary organization that used to be called the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council is now the Florida Invasive Species Council. So you might have heard about some government approaches, or maybe it's new to you, but there's a term called a blacklist, and that's what's employed by the state of Florida and pretty much the federal government as well. Anything can come into the state, any plant, unless it has a history of being noxious or invasive and has been listed specifically. So the assumption is these plants are fine, they're just plants, after all, until they're proven to be guilty of being an invasive species or noxious weed. The other approach from some governments like Australia, New Zealand, where there has been a long history of problems with expensive invasive species, they have what they call a whitelist approach. That means unless you're listed as an okay plant, you can't come in. So with their system, you're guilty until proven innocent. Each has its advantages and supporters, but we'll talk more about what we do in Florida and the United States, where we have specific lists of named species that are prohibited from sale. So just as a reminder, the federal noxious weed law started in 1974 when a lot of other environmental laws were initiated, like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the federal government defines a noxious weed with a focus on agriculture and economic cost. So it prohibits any living stage of a plant of foreign origin. So native plants cannot be listed as noxious weeds or invasive species by the federal government. These plants can injure crops or useful plants. They can directly or indirectly cause problems for livestock and anything related to agriculture. They do include fish and wildlife resources, problems with navigation, so our waterways, and public health. So they could prohibit a toxic plant. The Florida noxious weed list was started in 1993. It became clear eventually that the species listed by the federal government didn't include all the plants that are problems for Florida. Some plants are not widespread around the country and aren't considered to be a national problem, but they're quite problematic for Florida. For example, the white lead tree, Lucina leucocephala, it can grow easily in Florida, but not so much in colder places. It's a tropical plant. But in the rule of 1993, the focus was the same as that of the federal government: economic costs to agricultural plants. In 2004, Florida changed the rule and updated it to include invasive species because they understood they needed to take seriously the need to protect native plants in natural areas. So they began in 2004, even though that's a little late to the party, at least they arrived, or we arrived. So we now have a Florida noxious weed and invasive plant list, no longer just noxious weeds. And again, we say that's any living stage of a plant. So if you had dead noxious weeds, they would not be prohibited. So if you wanted to chop up melaleuca and sell it as mulch, as long as it's been treated so it's not possible to reproduce, that would not be prohibited. So a living stage of a serious agricultural threat, or one that has a negative impact on our endangered, threatened, or commercially exploited plants. So our native plants that are especially protected by these regulated categories are also especially protected if some exotic plant has a particular impact on those regulated species. And then any naturalized plant that disrupts native plant communities. So we are taking that step of going beyond noxious weeds that have economic problems to plants that disrupt natural communities. You might wonder, how are plants identified and added to Florida's noxious weed list? If a plant has to be listed to be prohibited, then that species has to get onto the list. And as we know, new plants are coming into the state all the time, or plants are changing enough to be observed as a problem all the time. So we have a form, FDAX 08215, which you can find on the internet. You can do a Google search for it, or you can go to the website that's listed there and find the form. It's not such an easy form to complete. It's not enough to say, I saw this plant in my neighbor's yard and it's climbing over the wall into my yard and it's bad. No, we have to have biological research justification. We have to know how putting it on the list will help stop this plant. How will it affect Florida's plant industry? We need to know, what is it really doing in agricultural and natural areas? So I always suggest, if someone contacts me and says there's a species that should be listed, but I find it for sale in my neighborhood nursery, I suggest they go to the local university or college biology staff for help. They could go to the county extension office. Just find someone who's got access to biological research and who's familiar with using that information. So we've talked about the governmental approaches. The non-governmental approaches you might be interested in, because if you're filling out our form, these people can help you with that biological research information that's going to be required. So we have the University of Florida IFAS Assessment of Non-Native Species in Natural Areas. So they review literature for non-native plants and decide how they might either currently affect natural areas or how they could be predicted to invade natural areas. And then the Florida Invasive Species Council has a list that was, as I mentioned, formerly FLEPSI, Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. So the IFAS assessment is a system for identifying the species that are invasive in Florida's natural areas. They consult land managers. They do extensive reviews of conservation biology and other biological literature to find out the impact of non-native species. They then categorize them based on a score of a rating tool they have. If they're invasive and not recommended, all the way to these are okay and not considered a problem, at least at this time. They can make recommendations for North, Central, South Florida, and their recommendations are followed by the county extension offices, Florida University staff, and other people who, like master gardeners, who often make recommendations to homeowners for plants to include in their yards. So an invasive plant would not be recommended. They also have a tool for predicting which species might become invasive if they were brought to Florida. Plants that don't have wide distribution in Florida yet, these plants can be brought to the attention of the IFAS staff, or they might find species on their own that they're concerned about, they can predict what plants might be on the horizon ready to come into Florida and find a good home if they get a foothold. With FLEPSI, FISC, the Florida Invasive Species Council, I'm trying to train myself to say that correctly. Every 2 years, they meet and compile a list that changes somewhat. It's revised, but that many plants stay the same. The council consists of botanists, ecologists, land managers, people who are well placed to understand where plants are spreading in natural areas. But again, their focus is natural areas, just like the IFAS focus. So something could be an agricultural weed and expensive for agriculture to eliminate and not be on either of those lists. For FISC, they have 2 categories. They're not exactly recommendations like the IFAS assessment, but they categorize plants as invasive exotics that have been already shown to alter native communities. Then they have a category 2, invasive exotics that are increasing, growing aggressively, but haven't been proven to alter natural systems as have those in category 1. So if you hear someone talk about category 1 and 2 invasives regulated by the state, that's a confusion of categories. So the state doesn't have categories of regulation. It's either prohibited or not prohibited. On the other hand, voluntary organizations like FISC can make distinctions among invasive plants, and they can also make recommendations based on regions of the state, whereas when the state regulates a plant as a noxious weed or invasive species, it's prohibited throughout the state. I thought you might like to see an example of how the process works. And even though we talked about governmental approaches and non-governmental approaches, we actually work together to try to get the best answer to the question of what's going to be prohibited. So I decided to include my personal nemesis, Ardisia crenata, coral ardisia. As an employee of the state, DPI, I can't recommend plants for inclusion on the noxious weed list myself, but I can say that this is a deserving plant. So in 2012, in June, a professor from the University of Florida was concerned enough about Ardisia crenata that he asked the federal government to do a weed risk assessment. So they, at the federal level, have a process for determining the likelihood of a plant becoming an invasive species. So they complied with the request, and by October of that year, they had produced the report. And as you can see from this photograph on the left, Ardisia crenata likes to take over the understory and block out any other plants. It does a really good job of taking over and becoming the sole citizen of a natural area, especially in wetlands. So this federal U.S. Department of Agriculture weed assessment uses biological information that they can collect and evaluate the probabilities of invasive status. They use computer models to come up with probabilities. And for Ardisia crenata, coral ardisia, they said the risk is high that it would be a major invader. So good to know. Looking at IFAS conclusions, their assessment of non-native plants in natural areas, in 2013, it was rated as invasive and not recommended, which is the worst conclusion they have to make. Of course, now if you look at their assessments, you'll see that it's listed as a prohibited plant because its status did change. It's spoiler. I forgot to do the spoiler alert. But another example of how bad this plant is, the Florida Invasive Species Council, which was then FLEPSI, rated it as Category 1, an invasive exotic species that has already altered native communities. The ways they look at are by displacing native species, and we saw that photograph of the understory where Ardisia crenata had taken over, by changing community structures or ecological functions, or by hybridizing with natives. So hybridizing is the only thing this bad plant isn't guilty of, as far as I know. So after all that information is collected from different sources, then the form is filled out and completed and submitted to the Division of Plant Industry, where a meeting of the Florida Noxious Weed Review Committee is generated. So when that form comes in, it's evaluated. If it's complete, then within 30 days, the review committee must meet. If the form is not filled out completely or doesn't provide sufficient information, it's returned for revision. So that's another reason I recommend you work together with biologists or other conservation professionals to get that form completed correctly and in depth. So this committee is made of 3 DPI staff members, our assistant director, the head of our Bureau of Plant Inspection, and 1 botanist. That's me. In addition, there are 2 University of Florida faculty members, 1 from a natural history, a natural science area, and 1 from weed science. So in this case, they met in March 2013. Process started in June 2012. Not quite a year later, we're making progress. So the committee voted that there was enough evidence that this species should be listed. So what happens next? Well, because the species have to be listed specifically, listed by name, then the rule that explains the consequences has to change just to add another name. Well, you can imagine the state of Florida is run by statutes and rules, and every department has rules. Division of Plant Industry has many rules, and all of them change from time to time. They go, after the change is requested, they go to Tallahassee to state lawyers for a legal review. The lawyers are required to answer questions like, is there an adverse impact on small business? Is this change likely to cost more than $200,000 in a year to execute? And then any other legal question that comes to their mind. So we have a stack of rules to send in. They have a stack of rules to review, and all this takes time. But eventually, a notice of the rule change is published, and citizens of Florida have 21 days to notice this change and request a hearing. In this case, no hearing was requested. So the rule change went forward. It was published and eventually became effective in July 2014. So just over 2 years, the idea of putting Ardisia crenata on the list went into effect. Sometimes it takes a little longer. I've noticed in election years, things in Tallahassee seem to slow down. I don't know why. And maybe it's not the truth. Maybe it's just an odd correlation that seemed to me, but who knows? I haven't done a study. But In July 2021, 2 new species were reviewed and recommended for listing, camphor tree and calorie pear. They're not yet listed, but the process has started, and eventually they will get on the list. In another recent example that went more quickly, Vitex rotundifolia, the beech vitex, was put on the list after only 13 months. So the process can take different amounts of time depending on how many rules are being changed, how many lawyers are working in Tallahassee, and whether or not there are public hearings and opposition to changing or opposition to listing of the species and changing its status. So it's tough to get these plants on the list, and usually by the time they're on the list, they've caused damage. They've become widespread. They become obvious that they're a problem. So some people might say, can't we do anything to keep potential weeds out? Well, Florida state regulations don't allow us to exclude any species that are not listed specifically in our rule. So that's the way our rule is written. And USDA, the federal government, was pretty much the same until 2011. They came up with a new category. It's called not authorized pending pest risk assessment. So if someone requests a federal permit to import a plant to be planted, their category is plants for planting, which you can imagine planting them could lead them to spread. So things that are new to the country, things that haven't been in our landscape very much in the past, are reviewed, and if there's any suggestion that they could be invasive because of their behavior in other countries, USDA has the authority to put them on this list, saying they're not authorized. They can't come into the country unless a pest risk assessment is done. You remember way back in the presentation, Ardisia crenata started with that federal weed risk assessment. So they can put these plants on hold until someone says, I really, really want to import this plant. Please do a pest risk assessment and let me bring it in. So in that case, they do their predictions, they have their computer models, and they do their best to decide whether something will actually be a problem or not. So it's a holding action, a sort of delaying technique that is now available at the federal level. Surely there are other things we can do. We don't just have governmental agencies, we have non-governmental agencies. So our universities and breeders associated with them or with private companies are always looking for new plants, new things to excite the customers and get people planting and buying plants. So at universities, there are often trial gardens. They can look for invasive characteristics there. Botanical gardens are now very aware of plants escaping and monitor plants as they are brought in from other countries for our education and enjoyment. Breeders are working on cultivars so that they can have slightly different plants, and some are focused on preventing invasive species by creating cultivars that are sterile. They produce no fruit, or their pollen is sterile, or they can somehow reduce other invasive species, other invasive traits, like making them less shade tolerant so they can't overtake the understory as easily. But we're humans, we're not perfect. And so these sterile cultivars might not be totally sterile. They might have ways of reproducing vegetatively, and reducing the invasive traits might not be reducing them enough in perfect condition. But if people do a good job and do find sterile cultivars or create sterile cultivars, those cultivars can be listed as exceptions to our rule. So even though a species is listed as invasive, for example, Ligustrum sinense, the rule can include an exception for a cultivar like Sunshine, which is shown to be a sterile cultivar. And so far, since it's been accepted, we haven't gotten reports of it reverting to the species type that's invasive. What are other things people do? Well, some states have tried putting money into consumer education. In some places, you might see celebrity gardeners or web influencers. Maybe someone from a native plant society in the state could try to explain to people the problems of noxious weeds and recommend native plants as substitutes for popular exotic ones. Some studies have shown that people who participate in invasive species removal are much less likely to buy noxious weeds and invasive plants. Well, how do you get them working on a work day? If you indulge me, I can tell you a personal story. I sometimes get requests from school students to help them with their homework. And after I grouse a bit about this younger generation should really do their own work, I generally help them because who knows, it could be the boss's cousin. So in one example, a young middle school student contacted me because he was required to do an essay about invasive species and he wanted some resources. So I looked up some websites. I found the county extension office website for the county he lived in. And by chance, they were having an exotic invasive removal day in the near future before his paper was due. So I said, you could call them, see what they're advertising. Maybe they have some literature you could use. Well, a few weeks later, I got an email from the student's mother who told me the student had gotten so excited about trying to control invasive species. He had dragged the whole family to the work day, and now he wanted to do a science fair project, and he was going to be a biologist. Well, I don't know if he would ever become a biologist or a conservation ecologist, but I was delighted to find that excitement in a young person, and maybe that's where some of our resources can go to try to bring through schools and children whole families out to experience natural areas and see the problems firsthand. Failing that, we can make good publications from universities, extension, other non-government organizations. Have tried various techniques of consumer education. One example is in California. We love our California brothers and sisters. The organization is called Plant Right, and they have a process of consumer education, nursery personnel education. They give continuing education units to nursery staff, teaching them about invasive species. They work with homeowners and landscape professionals to try to make people aware. And then they form partnerships with nurseries and they give them stickers they can put on their materials, their, cash register receipts, whatever they hand out. Sort of like the sustainable forestry certificates you see on products that were sustainably harvested, or coffee beans that respect the workers. So maybe we could have some kind of sticker that people would like to have, and make them more aware of invasive species as a problem. So I'd like to end with asking you all to think about what we might do to improve the process for listing plants, or new ideas for preventing plants from coming in before they become problems. Maybe just being more watchful and noticing our natural areas and plants that don't seem to belong there. Having you and your friends get out in nature wouldn't be a bad thing. So I appreciate your time. If you have questions about noxious weeds and invasive species, Florida regulations, or the Noxious Weed Review Committee, please get in touch with me. I think you can have my contact information in the chat. But for now, I'd just like to sing a little song for you. Dripping sweat in the hot sun, I fought the weeds and the weeds won. I fought the weeds and the weeds won. Spraying Roundup ton by ton, I fought the weeds and the weeds won. I fought the weeds and the weeds won. Gave up my fight and I feel so sad. I guess my fight is done. Or maybe goats wouldn't be so bad. I fought the weeds and the weeds won. I fought the weeds and the weeds won. Thank you very much.
Woo! Thank you, Patti.
Hi.
That was fabulous. So, go ahead, sorry.
I just said thank you.
Oh, welcome. Yeah. So, you're at home and you have your tohi earrings. They're
I do.
gorgeous. We have some really, oh, there's clapping. People are clapping in the chat.
Oh, thank you all. I appreciate your attention.
Okay, so we have a initial question from Mark Tomes. He asks, how does the department reconcile it when the mission to protect native plants interferes with protecting non-native industry sold plants, some of which are very invasive, such as asparagus fern?
We have to live with some ambiguity in life. As I described, there's a process for having species recognized and prohibited. And if plants have not been through that process, because of our approach prohibiting only things that are listed by name, then we have no authority by statute to prohibit their sale. So we depend on participation from citizens to make those unwanted species apparent to us and to evaluate them. And then the stakeholders in the nursery industry also get a voice. So it's a process.
And following that question, Melanie Simon asks, why can't the commercial sale of invasive plants be banned / made illegal?
Well, they can be prohibited species by species, but they're separate entities. The state has regulations and statutes, rules that are followed with legal enforcement. Things defined as invasive by other groups might or might not reach the standard that the state has for legal enforcement of non-sale. So if a species can be listed as a noxious weed or invasive species in our rule, which is allowed by statute, then its sale is prohibited.
So we may be aware from another group recognizing a species as invasive. We may be aware of the species invasive potential. However, there is no current mechanism for the state to automatically recognize those species as invasive and proceed into enforcement.
Right. Thank you.
Mark says, when you were discussing the definition of a noxious weed, and he's glad to see that it includes wildlife resources and not just commercial interests.
I'm glad to see that too. Thank you.
And he does ask, did I hear you say that as an employee of FDAX, you cannot recommend a plant be included on the invasive species list, a noxious weed list? If so, why is that?
It's considered a conflict of interest. I could say I don't want plants to be sold. We are responsible for inspecting the nurseries around the state and identifying plants that can't be sold. So it's to protect us as employees from being accused of trying to manipulate commercial sales.
And then there's a good, robust discussion here about the air potato beetle. That some people are having great success in Nassau County with beetles, and other people do not have beetles and don't know where to get them, and would like to know if your department is involved.
Yes, we have. I don't have the address at my fingertips, but people can email me or call the help desk. Just contact FDAX. You can Google air potato weevil, but we do ship them to homeowners. And I'm glad to hear their success in Nassau County.
And there's no cost affiliated with.
No cost, no.
Okay. Well, those were all the questions in the chat. So you must have done an excellent job in presenting this information.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have this chance to talk with Native Plant Society. I hope everyone has safe and happy holidays and look forward to the next time we have a chance to get together.
Yes. Thank you so much, Patti.
Thank you. And again, if you have questions, you have my email address and I'll be happy to help you in the future.
Yes, it's the email address was at the beginning of the presentation, and it's also in the description for this video. So this is the last Lunch and Learn before the end of the year. So I hope everyone has some wonderful holidays. I will be spending my time finding additional Lunch and Learn presenters. So if you have any ideas or requests, program requests, please feel free to email me, communications@fnps.org. And I hope you'll decide to join FNPS if you're not a member already, or if you do get my emails, you'll see I've included a very small text box about when your membership expires. So if you're wondering, if you're a member, if you get my emails on Monday, they'll let you know when your membership expires, and you can renew ahead of time, and it doesn't take any time off your membership. So I just renewed my membership, but if I had renewed it early, you still get a year added on. So I appreciate everyone who's involved in native plants and advocating for native plants and our native plant communities, and happy holidays. Bye, Patti.